Computer. Okay, so welcome back to Tanya. We are a few lines into Perek Gimel, chapter 3. You can go to the page on our website, jewisharcadia.com/7882, or the one posted in the chat. And we started talking about a couple of weeks ago. Last week we weren't able to have class, but a couple of weeks ago, that there's a certain structure of the divine expressions, and those 10 divine expressions are reflected in the human godly soul. So I actually put together a little chart over here. I don't know if you can see it on your phone, but you can see on the left-hand side, you have the name of attributes, we'll call it that. And then we have the divine attributes in Atzilut, also known as Sefirot. And the same type of attribute is also in the godly soul within a person. There are 10 godly expressions within our soul. However, the term used when these 10 attributes are mentioned in the divine attributes as God's attributes in Atzilut, as Sfirot, they're called 3 mothers and 7 doubles, or 7 children. And then in the human soul, they're basically intellect and emotions. That's what they are. And the intellect and emotions derive themselves from the mothers and the doubles in Atzilut, in the Sefirot. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if you notice, the Malchut, the last one on the bottom, is a very similar color to the 6 above it, but slightly different, because we'll see there's a certain slight variation to what Malchut is versus the other 6 above it. But we're not going to get into that right now. So in general, it's divided into 2 things. It's the intellect and the emotions. And so we're up to the words Haseichel, Koilo, Chachma, Bina Vadas. I'm going to stop the share so that we can kind of focus on the content. We can reference the chart at a later point. So in the Tanya page on our website, it's by the words. It's kind of parallel to the box that says hospital chaplaincy, if at least the way it's laid out on my thing. But anyways, we're up to the words v'chachma bina das, or v'chabad. The Chabad, which are the intellectual faculties, so they are the mothers, the source of the emotions. So let's just go back for a second. We were saying that intellect includes Chabad, Chachma, Bina, Das, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and Midas, emotions, are the love of Hashem, the dread or the fear of Hashem, and the glorification of Hashem. These are all emotions that the soul expresses. So let's understand what these emotions, or what these midos, are in the human soul, in the divine soul placed in a human being, right? So the first characteristic, the first emotion that we mention, is the characteristic of love. What is love, right? Isn't there a song, What is Love, right? So according to Chassidus, what is love? Love is a feeling of feeling drawn towards something. You feel drawn closer towards a thing or a person, and that is the way chesed, the way the attribute of kindness is expressed, it's expressed by doing a kind act to a fellow human being. Now, what is the pneumius? What's the deeper motive behind the kind act? The motive behind the kind act is a feeling of love and closeness to your counterpart, whoever that person might be. Now, that's just broadly speaking defining what is love and what is kindness, right? Now, how does this play out in the godly soul? The godly soul, which is, of course, a piece of God above, literally, as we said in chapter 2, and all the attributes, all the powers of the godly soul are exclusively dedicated to God and the service thereof. So all its attributes, all its emotions are just tools or intermediaries to help a person come close to godliness. So what is chesed in the godly soul? Chesed is the love of God. So that's the first midah, the first emotion. The second midah is fear. Now, what is fear? There's no song on that, as far as I know. What is fear? Fear is leaning away from, distancing yourself from a particular thing or person. We have this concept at the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. It says that God revealed himself to the Jewish people, and it was such an intense divine revelation that the nation saw, by Yara'am, by Yanu, they were moved. They fell out of their seats. In fact, they bounced 3,000 feet away. Right? Why? Because it was fearful. It was a shock. It shocked their system. Right? So when we talk about the midah, the emotion of gevura, of severity, the pneumius of severity, the deeper part of it is the prevention of nurture, the opposite of giving, which is basically you're distancing yourself from the person. When you have to judge somebody, right? A judge by law is not allowed to be a relative of one of the litigants, right? Because if you're too close to something, you cannot judge it. You cannot be objective. So in order to judge something, you have to distance yourself from that thing. So whereas love, by definition, means coming close to a thing, fear, by definition, means distancing yourself from a thing. And the lack of giving to that thing and the lack of coming close. And that's what we call, by the godly soul, we call it Yiras Hashem, fear of God. Now, of course, it doesn't actually mean that we distance ourselves physically or spiritually, but it's an emotion that we're talking about. We're talking about an emotion of feeling distant from God. And then the third feeling, the third emotion, is what we call tiferes, the beauty of the godly soul. That means to glorify God and his Torah with all sorts of glorifications and trying to attach oneself and see the praises and beauty of God with all your soul. So by way of analogy, when a person sees a king who is, all decked out in all his majesty and glory, just the mere gazing upon the king and the appreciation of the king and the exaltedness of the king can trigger a person who's observing this to begin extolling the virtues and the praises of that king. And the same is true by way of analogy when we're talking about the beauty or glorification of the godly soul, the midah of tiferes, of beauty. It means that a person is just awestruck, I wouldn't say awestruck, but just that's more of the second type, but more just amazed and taken over by appreciation of God's glory. So these are the first three of the seven emotions. Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes. Or as we listed them on our chart over here, how do we translate them? Kindness, severity, and beauty. So the Alter Rebbe says, "V'chachma bina das," and now the three mothers, the three blue rows in that chart, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, nikru imais umakar lamidais. They're called mothers, or a source for the emotions. Why? Ki hamidais hinteldes Chabad, because the emotions are really children of, or offshoots of, the intellect. So just as when we're talking about God's divine attributes in Atzilos, the spheros, the first three spheros are called mothers. So by way of a parallel, when we're talking about the godly soul and the human being, these three intellectual powers are also called mothers, because the emotions are like the children that come out of the mother. Why are they being referred to as parents and children? Why is that a proper analogy? Because in order for a person to feel any sort of feeling towards a particular thing or person, the person has to understand and appreciate the subject matter in his intellect. And if a person thinks about it adequately and comes to a recognition that, this thing or this person is actually good for me, right? So I'm going to start feeling a desire and a love and whatever it might be towards that thing or person, wanting to get close to that. Now, if after contemplating and thinking about whatever subject it is, I'm going to be afraid of it, then and I'm going to feel distant from it, the more I understand how bad that thing is for me, the more I will want to distance myself from it. So seichel amidos, intellect and emotions, really work like a mother and children. That it starts in the intellect, and it results it results in an emotion. So what does this mean? Again, translating this into the godly soul's experience. In order for the godly soul to openly feel feelings of love or fear and trepidation towards godliness, it begins with the soul understanding and appreciating what is this thing we call God, right? In fact, this is not just a Hasidus or Kabbalistic invention. This is something that Maimonides, in his Code of Jewish Law, in his magnum opus, in the Yad HaChazaka, he writes very clearly in the foundational laws of the Torah, and meaning in the principles of our faith, as he writes them in the beginning of his book. He says, it's actually in chapter 2 of the entire, I don't know how many chapters, I'd say over 900 chapters, maybe even 1,000 chapters. So in chapter 2 of all of those, he says, now what is the path to the love and fear of God? Question mark. And the Rambam answers that when a person thinks, and he goes on, etc., and sees that God has no limit and no rank and no way to measure him, etc., then you'll begin to love him, and you'll have a great desire to know even more about him, and you're going to be like, thrown off your chair from just, recognizing what kind of distance there is between who you are and the rank where God is. So you see that Maimonides also goes by this sequence of intellect first, which creates the emotion. And he also mentions, Maimonides mentions this point as well in his Laws of Tshuva, that love of God is dependent on how well you know and understand him. Now that we understand that there are these categories of, there's intellect and there are emotions, and just stating the fact that intellect causes emotions, and God forbid it should never be the other way around, right? Because then you're in trouble. Then you have a system malfunction, right? Just think about it. What would it look like if somebody's emotions controlled how their intellect operated, right? So then that's like a child in a candy store, right? I want candy. I like candy. And what's he going to do if he doesn't get the candy? Then even though his father or mother might say, you know what, you could only have one candy from this pack of 50 candies, they're going to try to figure out a way. How am I going to get it from the pantry? Not that this ever happened, but how am I going to get it from the pantry? You know, and basically start using their intellect in order to satisfy their emotions, right? That is a system malfunction. Or let's just say, it's not the system operating as it's intended to be. Perhaps this is a manifestation of the fact that the godly soul only enters a child fully at the age of bar bas mitzvah, right? So that's why children are lacking that normal system of the godly soul, where you start with the intellect, and that feeds the emotions. That's the way it's meant to be, at least, right? So now the question is, how do we do that? How do we take control of the steering wheel and make sure that we're starting with intellect and allowing the intellect to dictate the emotions? So that's part of what we're going to continue to explain in the rest of the chapter. But before we go further, just want to clarify or summarize some of the things we said so far. As far as the definition of the soul's powers, the godly soul's powers. So number one, we said we divided them into two categories: intellect and emotions, right? In the chart that I showed before, the blue and the pink. And we also said that the powers of the intellect are the source of the emotions. And with these two definitions, that there are intellect and emotions, and that the intellect feed the emotions, the Alter Rebbe is actually establishing one of the foundational principles of serving Hashem according to Chassidus, as he'll explain at greater length throughout Tanya. Because this is teaching a person, how do you achieve a very deep avoida primius, inner work, right? Like they say in therapy, you got to do the inner work. So this is Hasidic therapy. You got to do the inner work. How do you change your insides that you should be able to serve Hashem even with your heart? Remember, that was the foundational verse of the whole Tanya on the cover page of the Tanya. The Alter Rebbe's mission statement here is, I'm here to help you fulfill the commandment of the Torah, or the promise of the Torah, that coming to feel and love Hashem is very close to you in your mouth and in your heart. Meaning, to feel the feeling of love for God is attainable. So how do we attain that? It's one thing to just go through the motions and do mitzvahs. That's great, and of course that has infinite value. But the goal is to also internalize these feelings towards Hashem, and that's something that we're setting out here in only the third of 53 chapters. And how do we do that? And so, based on this foundation, the key to serving Hashem in this way is by activating the powers of the seichel, of the emotions, of the chabad, the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge of the godly soul. Because the emotions, after all, are children and a result of the intellect. So if you want to get to the emotions, if you want to get to the heart, as the verse says, it's got to be in your heart. You don't start in the heart. You got to start in the brain. You got to start in the intellect, and then you could eventually make it to the heart. And more than that, if all feelings, also worldly feelings, are a result of our seichel, We cannot feel anything towards God if it's not tangible, if we don't see or experience godliness in any way. So if our goal is to feel something towards God, we have to crystallize that reality in our intellect. Now, even here's an important thing to understand, and that is that normally we're attracted to emotionally to physical things, physical objects or people, right? And that's what we have feelings towards. But the truth is that when we use our seichel, when we start with the intellect first, the intellect has a unique ability beyond, let's say, just what the eyes can see, but the intellect is able to appreciate things that are far beyond the human realm. And the intellect is a unique tool that's able to help us appreciate and become aware of something that's outside of ourselves. You see, normally our emotions are associated with, let's say, our eyes, right? Our eyes could see only physical things. Our eyes cannot see spiritual things. We only see physical things. We see seltzer, we see mango, we see beautiful trees, and we may feel attracted towards those things and love it and appreciate it, right? But that's only using our eyes, and from our eyes it goes straight to our heart. But our intellect is actually able to appreciate and give birth to, similar to a mother, is able to give birth to a feeling of love towards God. Now, one other point, and that is from the fact that God implanted into our nature, into our soul's nature, that the intellect is what gives birth to the midas, to the emotions in the heart, we can understand and appreciate how it's very close for every person to serve God even in his heart. Meaning that a person should be able to feel drawn towards God and to live a life of spirituality, even though it may be very difficult to transform your heart from desiring worldly pleasures to channel that love into loving godliness at all times. And the answer to that is, even though it could be very difficult, you might be naturally inclined to feel and love certain things. But again, by laying out this principle that it all starts in the mind, we're saying, look, the same way you can think about different things and you can discover and learn and appreciate new things intellectually, if that is what controls everything in the emotions, then it should be very easy, or at least very simple, to then control the emotions that result and flow from those intellectual ideas. So whereas you might look at the emotions and say, no, this is what I like, this is how I feel, this is, and I can't change that, by sidestepping the emotions and going to the source and recognizing that the intellect is the source, and changing the source and working on the source, working on the intellect to appreciate godliness more, now it's a much more natural process to be able to transform those emotions eventually. So to summarize what we've learned so far in the first chapter, the holy soul, the godly soul in every Jew is made up of 10 attributes. Those 10 attributes are divided into two parts. I'll pull up the chart again over here because I think it's helpful to have the visual. Those 10 parts are divided into two categories. There's the 3 intellectual faculties, the 7 emotional faculties, and these 10 attributes within the human godly soul, they're nishtalshal, they devolve from the 10 supernal sfirot, which are also divided into two categories. There's the Chachma Bina Das, which is called the mothers, and then there's the 7 supernal emotions, which result from them. They're the children of those mothers. And just like the sefirot in the godly realm are called mothers, and that's where the 7 emotions come from. So too in the human soul, the emotions of a person result from the intellect, the 3 intellectual faculties that a person possesses. So this is a very empowering lesson to us to realize that if we're struggling emotionally, it doesn't always have to be fixed in the emotional realm, but in fact, you can work on the intellectual realm and learn, in other words, practically speaking. I think what the lesson over here is, practical takeaway is that the more we learn Chassidus, the more we understand divine wisdom, the more we appreciate these Kabbalistic ideas and understand the functioning of the world. Remember, the Chassidus is the blueprint of the world. Torah is the blueprint of the world. This is telling us how the world actually operates. And we're being taught here that intellect is where it begins and the emotions flow from there. And when we realize that, it's actually very empowering because it tells us, okay, if I'm struggling emotionally in my connection with Hashem, in my relationship with Judaism, maybe I need to learn a little more. Maybe I need to understand and appreciate a little more. And once I do that, then suddenly I'll enjoy everything that I'm doing at an even greater level. And we'll continue Mitzvah Hashem next week, further in chapter 3. Thank you very much.